The search for home, when belonging found its voice. The question hung in the air like a prayer waiting for an answer. Steve Harvey stood at his podium, cards in hand, expecting the usual rapid-fire responses that made Family Feud the entertainment juggernaut it had become. Instead, silence stretched across the studio like a held breath, broken only by the gentle hum of stage lights and the distant shuffle of an audience, suddenly aware they were witnessing something profound. 25-year-old Mei-Lin Chen stood at the contestant podium, her delicate hands gripping the wooden edge with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the moment. She wore a soft lavender blouse and dark jeans, her long black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that framed a face caught between cultures, between worlds, between questions that had no easy answers. "We asked 100 people," Steve had announced with his trademark energy. "Name something you've been searching for your whole life." He'd expected the obvious responses. Love, maybe. Success. Happiness. The kinds of answers that would light up the board and keep the game moving toward its inevitable, entertaining conclusion. Instead, Mei-Lin looked directly into his eyes and spoke 3 words that would transform this episode from a game show into something much deeper. "Where I belong." The studio fell silent. Not the comfortable quiet of anticipation, but the heavy silence that follows truth spoken in a place unprepared to receive it. Steve's smile flickered as he processed what he'd heard. The cameras continued rolling, capturing something that couldn't be scripted or manufactured, the moment when entertainment collided with the deepest human needs. Behind the scenes, producers struggled to understand what was happening. This wasn't in their playbook. Contestants were supposed to be enthusiastic, competitive, focused on winning money and having fun on television. They weren't supposed to reveal the searching, aching heart of what it meant to live between identities. Mei-Lin Chen had been adopted from China when she was 8 months old by loving parents in suburban Minneapolis. Robert and Susan Chen were both professors at the University of Minnesota, kind, intellectual people who had chosen international adoption after years of infertility struggles. They had given her every advantage: excellent schools, music lessons, travel opportunities, unconditional love, and encouragement to excel. But love, no matter how deep and genuine, couldn't fill the space where questions lived. Questions about the woman who had carried her for 9 months, then made the impossible decision to let her go. Questions about the culture she'd been separated from, the language she might have spoken, the traditions she might have inherited. Questions about why she sometimes felt like a stranger in her own reflection. The Chen family had come to Family Feud as part of Mei-Lin's ongoing search for connection, for something that felt authentic and real. Her adoptive parents sat in the audience with her boyfriend David and her best friend Sarah, all of them expecting a fun day of television and perhaps some prize money. None of them had expected this moment of raw honesty that would leave everyone in the studio questioning what home really means. "Miss Chen," Steve said softly, setting down his cards and moving away from his podium. The formality of using her last name somehow made the moment more respectful, more serious. "What do you mean by that?" The question opened something in Mei-Lin that had been carefully sealed for years. Tears gathered in her dark eyes as she looked out at the studio audience, at cameras that would broadcast her vulnerability to millions, at people who couldn't possibly understand the complexity of living between worlds. "I mean," she began, her voice barely audible over the studio's sound system, "that I've spent 25 years feeling like I'm visiting everywhere I go, even in my own home, with people who love me more than life itself. I sometimes feel like a guest who's overstayed her welcome." The rival family, the Patterson clan from Texas, stood frozen at their podium. They were a large, boisterous group who had driven 12 hours for this opportunity, expecting competition and laughter. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to someone's deepest pain being shared with strangers. "My parents are incredible people," Mei-Lin continued, her voice gaining strength even as tears began to flow. "They've given me everything: education, opportunities, love, support. They've never made me feel anything less than completely their daughter. But they can't give me the one thing I've been searching for my whole life. Steve found himself moving closer to her, drawn by something he couldn't name. Maybe it was recognition of pain that transcended cultural boundaries. Maybe it was the understanding that some searches aren't about finding something lost, but about finding something that was never given the chance to exist. "What's that, sweetheart?" Steve asked gently. "The feeling of belonging somewhere because I was born there, not because someone chose me," Mei-Lin said, and the words seemed to surprise her as much as anyone. "I love my family. I'm grateful for my family. But I've never stopped wondering about the family that looks like me, that shares my blood, that might help me understand why I am the way I am." The studio audience was completely silent now. Even the usual rustling of programs and shifting in seats had stopped. 300 people held their breath as this young woman unpacked a lifetime of searching for something that most people took for granted: the simple knowledge of where they came from. "Every mirror is a question mark," Mei-Lin continued, as if years of unspoken thoughts were finally finding voice. "Every photo of my family is beautiful, and I'm grateful to be in it. But I'm also aware that I'm the only one who looks like me. Every cultural celebration feels both mine and not mine. I participate, but I'm also aware that I'm learning traditions that should have been in my blood." Steve Harvey, who had built his career on understanding people, on reading audiences, on knowing what would connect with viewers, found himself in completely uncharted territory. This wasn't about entertainment anymore. This was about identity, about the profound human need to understand where we come from in order to understand where we're going. "Mei-Lin," Steve said, using her first name now, making the connection more personal. "When did you start feeling this way?" "I think I always felt it," she answered immediately. "But I didn't have words for it until I was in college. I was in an Asian American studies class, and the professor talked about the concept of forever foreigner. This idea that no matter how American you are, people will always see you as from somewhere else. But for me, it was the opposite. I felt like a forever outsider even from my own ethnicity." The camera operators, who had seen hundreds of tapings, found themselves emotionally invested in ways that surprised them. In the control room, producers who usually focused on pacing and commercial breaks were reaching for tissues. "I've studied Mandarin, but I'll never be a native speaker," Mei-Lin said, her voice growing stronger with each admission. "I've learned about Chinese culture, but I'm learning it as an outsider, not inheriting it as birthright. I've traveled to China 3 times, and each time I feel like I should recognize something, should feel some ancestral connection. But I'm just another tourist with a camera and a guidebook." Steve felt something twist in his chest. This wasn't about typical identity issues or teenage confusion about belonging. This was about the profound disconnection that comes from being severed from cultural roots, no matter how lovingly transplanted into new soil. "And your family?" Steve asked. "How do they handle this?" "They try so hard," Mei-Lin said with a laugh that held both love and sadness. "My mom learned to cook Chinese food, which was sweet, but it's not the Chinese food from whatever region I'm actually from. My dad put me in Mandarin classes, but he couldn't give me the stories that come with the language, the context that makes words mean more than just sounds." She paused, looking directly at her adoptive parents in the audience. "They love me enough to let me search, which is more than many adoptive parents can handle. But they can't search with me, because they don't know what we're looking for either." The Patterson family, their competitors in this forgotten game, had tears in their eyes. Martha Patterson, a mother of 4 biological children, whispered to her husband, "I never thought about what it would feel like not to know where you came from." Steve Harvey had spent decades hosting television shows, meeting thousands of people, hearing countless stories, but standing there looking at Mei-Lin Chen, he saw something that demanded more than entertainment value. He saw a young woman courageously articulating a pain that millions of adoptees carried in silence. "Mei-Lin," Steve said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what it meant. "Search for belonging. What does home feel like to you?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She paused, considering, as if no one had ever asked her to define the feeling rather than the place. Home feels like recognition, she said finally. It feels like walking into a room and seeing faces that share your features, hearing voices that carry the same rhythms as yours, understanding jokes without having the punchline explained. Steve nodded, his expression shifting from entertainer to something deeper. And you've been looking for that feeling your whole life? Every day, Mei-Lin confirmed. In crowds, I scanned for faces that might be related to mine. In restaurants, I listen to conversations in Mandarin and wonder if I'm hearing my grandmother's voice. In movies, I watch Asian families and try to imagine what it would feel like to belong there automatically, instead of having to earn my way in. The studio lights seemed harsher now, too bright for this kind of vulnerability. But Mei-Lin wasn't finished. Having started this journey into truth, she seemed unable to stop. The hardest part isn't the not knowing, she continued. It's the guilt about the searching. My parents gave me everything, and sometimes I feel like my questions about my birth family are a betrayal of their love. Like I'm saying their love isn't enough. Steve Harvey, who had made millions of people laugh, who had hosted thousands of hours of television, who prided himself on always having the right response, found himself in territory that demanded more than wit or charm. This required wisdom, compassion, and the kind of truth that heals. "Baby girl," Steve said, and something in his voice had changed completely. This wasn't the game show host anymore. This was a father figure, a mentor, a man who understood that some moments transcend entertainment. "Let me tell you something that I need you to hear." He began removing his suit jacket, his movements deliberate and symbolic. The jacket was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, expensive. It represented success, achievement, belonging earned through talent and hard work. "Searching for where you came from doesn't diminish where you are," Steve said, draping the jacket around Mei-Lin's shoulders. "Loving the family that raised you doesn't mean you can't wonder about the family that created you. And belonging isn't something you have to choose between. It's something you get to build." The jacket was too big for Mei-Lin's small frame, but she pulled it closer as if it were armor against a world that had always made her feel like she had to choose sides. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Steve continued, his hands resting gently on her shoulder. "I see someone who belongs everywhere. Because you've learned that belonging isn't about blood or birthplace. It's about love, and you've been loved in Minnesota, and you could be loved in China, and you're loved right here in this studio by people who didn't even know your name 10 minutes ago." The audience began to react, not with applause but with the quiet sounds of recognition, soft sobs, gentle murmurs, the rustling of tissues being passed between strangers who suddenly understood they were witnessing something sacred. "But what if I never find them?" Mei-Lin asked, her voice small and vulnerable. "What if I spend my whole life searching for people who don't want to be found?" Steve turned to address not just Mei-Lin but the entire studio, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned hard truths about identity and belonging. "Then you'll have learned something important about yourself," he said. "You'll have learned that you're brave enough to seek truth even when it's uncomfortable. You'll have learned that love comes in many forms, and the love you received from your adoptive family is just as real and valuable as any biological connection could ever be." The camera caught Mei-Lin's adoptive parents in the audience, tears streaming down their faces as they watched their daughter receive validation they'd never known how to give. Robert Chen reached for his wife's hand, both of them realizing that their daughter's search wasn't a rejection of their love, but an expansion of it. "Mei-Lin," Steve said, turning his attention back to her, "I want you to do something for me. I want you to look out there at your family and tell me what you see." Mei-Lin turned toward the audience, toward the people who had raised her, loved her, supported her search even when it must have broken their hearts a little. "I see people who chose me," she said quietly. "I see people who loved me before they even knew who I would become." "And that's not nothing," Steve said firmly. "That's everything. That's the foundation. Everything else you find, Everyone else you discover, it's built on that foundation of chosen love. Steve began to speak directly to the camera, knowing that millions of adoptees and adoptive families were watching, needing to hear what he was about to say. To anyone out there who's searching for where they belong, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity, let me tell you something. Home isn't just the place you came from. Home is also the place that chose you, the place that kept you, the place that loved you into who you are today. He turned back to Mei-Lin, his expression tender and protective. And to you, sweetheart, I want you to know that your search is valid. Your questions are important, and your feelings don't make you ungrateful. They make you human. The game show had been completely forgotten. This wasn't about points or prizes anymore. This was about identity, about the complex web of belonging that connects all humans to something larger than themselves. Steve, Mei-Lin said, her voice steady now, what if belonging isn't about finding the right place, but about accepting that I get to create my own definition of home? Steve smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. Now you're talking like someone who understands that the most powerful kind of belonging is the kind you choose for yourself. As confetti fell and the studio audience rose to their feet, Mei-Lin Chen stood wrapped in Steve Harvey's jacket. No longer the woman searching desperately for a place to fit. She was someone who understood that belonging could be built, that identity could be chosen, that home could be created rather than just discovered. The episode ended, but the conversation continued in homes across America, where adoptive families talked about identity and belonging with new vocabulary, new understanding, new permission to hold multiple truths simultaneously. 6 months later, Steve received an email with a photo attached. It showed Mei-Lin standing in front of a community center, wearing his jacket over a t-shirt that read, Adoptee Advocate. The email explained that she had started a support group for adult adoptees, a place where people could share their story, their searches, their complex feelings about identity and belonging, without judgment or the pressure to be grateful in ways that negated their questions. Mr. Harvey, the email read, I wanted you to know that I'm still searching, but I'm searching differently now. I'm not looking for a place to belong anymore. I'm building places where belonging is possible for people like me. Your jacket reminds me every day that sometimes the most important discoveries happen not when we find what we're looking for, but when we realize we had the power to create it all along. The support group had grown to include not just adoptees, but also adoptive parents, learning to support their children's searches, birth parents processing their own complex feelings about placement, and anyone who had ever felt caught between worlds, between identities, between definitions of home that didn't quite fit. Mei-Lin's story had resonated particularly strongly with transracial adoptees, mixed-race individuals, immigrants, and anyone who had experienced the particular loneliness of not fitting neatly into predetermined categories. Her courage in articulating the complexity of belonging had given permission for others to speak their own truths about identity, family, and the ongoing work of creating home. Today, Mei-Lin Chen works as a social worker specializing in adoption services. Her office wall features the framed Family Feud episode photo, Steve's business card, and letters from the adoptees she's helped navigate their own searches, some successful in finding biological family, others successful in making peace with questions that may never have answers. She still wears Steve's jacket to important meetings, to speaking engagements, to moments when she needs to remember that belonging isn't something you find but something you build. And she's learned that the most profound kind of home isn't the one you're born into, but the one you create from love, choice, courage, and the willingness to hold space for all the pieces of yourself, even the ones that don't fit together perfectly. The search for belonging, Mei-Lin discovered, isn't about finding the right answers. It's about learning to love the questions, to honor the complexity, to build bridges between the different parts of your story, rather than choosing just one part to call home. And sometimes, the most important lesson you can learn is that belonging is less about where you came from and more about where you choose to plant your love, your energy, your commitment to making space for others who are also learning what it means to be home in your own skin. Where she belonged, it turned out, was everywhere she chose to build belonging for others. And that was more than enough. It was everything.